Oh.
Well, good afternoon, and thank you very much for attending the presentation of the final report of the European Union Election Observation Mission to Zimbabwe. May I introduce the table here. Next to me is our Deputy Chief Observer, excuse me, Mark Stevens. Thank you. Then we have Irene Guanari, she's the legal analyst of the mission. Then next to her is Margarita Alves, she's the election analyst. And then from the EU delegation, we have here Patrick Lambrechts, thank you very much. He sits here because, well, the EU election observation mission comes today to an end, and activities will be taken over to some extent by the EU delegation. So let me pass the floor to Mark Stevens, who will present the final report.
Yes, okay, thank you. Sorry for that. I had worst experiences when I used to play in a band and we always had feedback, so I'm used to this situation. Okay, well, welcome to the press conference. It's a great pleasure to be here, to be back in Zimbabwe to present the final report of the EU Election Observation Mission. I should start off by passing on the apologies of our Chief Observer, Mr. Elmar Brok. As you may recall, a member of the European Parliament who led our team. Unfortunately, for medical reasons, he was unable to join us at the very last moment. So he sends his apologies, but asked us to carry on the visit on his behalf. So we are here today to do that. The purpose of the return visit is something the European Union does on all its observation missions. Approximately 2 months after the preliminary statement that we issued after the election, is to return to release the final report, copies of which will be made available afterwards, which is our final analysis on the election and our conclusions on the election. And also, very importantly, and it's the thing I'll focus on mostly today, are our recommendations for the future. And these recommendations, which I'll talk about a little bit in a moment, are designed to improve the process for 2023, to address the shortcomings we identified in 2018, and to help build a more robust and credible process for elections in Zimbabwe. All our work, and I remember explaining this many, many times during our time here in Zimbabwe, all our analysis is based on relevant international and regional standards for elections. Our job was to assess the extent to which the elections were credible in terms of those international and regional standards. Likewise, the recommendations we offer are all in line with relevant regional and international standards. They're not plucking out ideas from thin air. They're saying, according to international standards, these are the sort of benchmarks countries should be aiming towards. And our recommendations are really geared towards helping Zimbabwe take steps in that direction. We believe they can help identify a number of the key shortfalls that we identified. And I think what I would do for the purpose of the press conference is, the recommendations themselves cover all aspects of the election, from the legal framework, election administration, political parties and election campaign, voter registration, the conduct of the media, voting, counting, results, and the post-election environment. But for the purpose of this press conference, I think I'll focus on just some of our priority recommendations, and also try and group them into 4 areas which I think will make more sense to people. These 4 areas are looking at the independence and the effectiveness of the election management body, the Zimbabwe Electoral Commission. That's one category. The second category is how to achieve a more level playing field and conducive environment for the elections. The third category will be the legal framework for the conduct of elections. And the fourth category is the inclusiveness of the process and the participation rights therein. With regards to how to increase the confidence in the process in terms of the perception of the Zimbabwe Electoral Commission, we firstly believe it's very important to further strengthen the independence of the Zimbabwe Electoral Commission. It is created as an independent body, but for certain reasons in the law, there are certain sort of qualifications on that. For example, the role of the Ministry of Justice in overseeing the regulations of ZEC. We believe that independence could be further enhanced. Secondly, and this reflects our observations in the pre-election period, and I think it's one of the most critical findings, was ZEC's communication policy on the election. We believe that ZEC should provide a more effective and timely information during the election in order to enhance transparency and confidence. And this can affect a whole range of its work, from notification on its decisions to information on the voter roll, and also the breakdown of results after the election and presenting these in a more timely and transparent way. I think that all in all, this issue of communication and transparency of the Electoral Commission was a critical area. And finally is the results management process itself. We felt that the results lacked a sort of verifiability and traceability, and this helped plug into the lack of confidence and the tension after the election as the result was challenged. That it took a long time for this result to be broken down and for the Electoral Commission to explain how the final result was ascertained. And this could involve elements such as publication of the original V11s or V23 forms and such things. The second sort of area I'll focus on is this issue of the level playing field and the conducive environment for the election. Firstly, one of our findings that we issued in our preliminary statement was very much about the bias that was shown in the state media coverage of the election, be it television or radio. State media is fundamentally important in the Zimbabwean context, given its monopoly of the radio and dominance of the TV sector and newspapers. So we feel state media must be more impartial in its coverage, and we've offered a number of recommendations on how this might be achieved. Also to liberalise the media environment and to provide licences for private media to be established, which is another sort of stumbling block at the moment. We believe that legal measures should also be introduced to mitigate the abuse of incumbency and the abuse of state resources during the election. While we acknowledge there's always an advantage of incumbency, there should be sort of clear lines so everyone understands where that advantage ends and where abuse starts, and particularly on state resources and such things. And this could involve the sort of limitations on the use of or the launching of aid programs during the election campaign, for example, as well as other activities. Another issue that we would raise in terms of the environment for the election is we feel there need to be campaign finance regulations linked to the need for political parties to disclose their sources of funding, but also their expenditure during an election. This will help increase transparency and accountability in the political process, and can also be used as one way of helping to sort of minimise the abuse of state resources as well. We do recognise this is a challenge, and I think every country on the planet struggles with effective campaign finance regulations. But in Zimbabwe at the moment, I think there's a complete absence of such things in terms of disclosures, so we feel that steps could be taken in that regard. The final issue on to create a more level playing field is the constituency boundaries for the National Assembly elections. The Constitution says these should be a roughly equal size with no discrepancy beyond 20%, if my memory serves me right. There's massive discrepancies in the electoral constituencies in Zimbabwe, and some quite pronounced ones. And this means that there is not equal suffrage for the election. So we feel to redraw the boundaries of the electoral constituencies in order to create them to be more of an equal size. The third category I mentioned was about the legal framework for the elections. We've got a number of issues, but I'll just focus on two here. One is that prior to the 2018 elections, there was an effort made to reform legislation generally to bring it more into line with the 2013 Constitution. But this wasn't finally achieved, and there remain areas where the electoral legislation could be further reformed to bring it into line with the Constitution. For example, about the right to vote and who this applies to, but also secondly in terms of the independence of the Electoral Commission again, and some other areas. The second issue under the legal framework is about the need to create appropriate time limits for the determination of pre-election disputes. We noted quite a number of court cases in the pre-election period where the court didn't reach a decision, but the decisions were deferred or the cases were deferred, so that justice was not done and rights were not protected prior to the election. We feel the establishment of sort of time limits for those election-related cases, much as there are for the petitions in the post-election period, could be helpful in order to ensure that all these cases are dealt with in a timely manner and the right to an effective legal remedy is properly provided for. In order to make, the final category I talked about was inclusivity, and here I'll just talk about two issues. One is the voter registration. We feel that the voter registration was a major effort on behalf of the Electoral Commission, a brand new process of biometric registration, which created quite an inclusive list. But it's clear that there are still areas where further under-registration exists, particularly in the urban areas of Harare and Bulawayo, where the level of registration was approximately 65% of the eligible population, compared to about 80% in other parts of the country. So again, this means that universal suffrage and equal suffrage are not properly provided for. There is also some other sort of technical issues around voter registration, and I suspect ZEC, which is now undertaking its own review of the process, will reflect a lot on how it did voter registration and maybe learn its own lessons. But just one issue we focused on was how to properly identify voters to make sure everyone is satisfied that the person is who they say they are and that their address is properly captured so they can be allocated to the proper polling station, to avoid some of the debate and discrepancies around the voter roll that we identified for the election. The second and final issue on inclusivity is, and I mentioned it earlier, is the role of the multi-party liaison committees. These were created quite a long time, I think a couple of years before or a year before the elections. And we feel that these should be used, or could be a very positive tool for dialogue in the pre-election period, conflict resolution, but also as a means for the Electoral Commission to have a more productive relationship with political parties during the election period. So if these are held more often and in a more meaningful way, this could be another sort of effective, inclusive sort of tool in the lead up to the election. These recommendations are very much offered to support a sort of positive democratic direction in Zimbabwe. In our report, as we did in our preliminary statement, we focused quite strongly on many of the shortcomings that we found. And if you recall our preliminary statement, we were quite critical of many aspects of the election. And this continues in our final report, where we come to a sort of a final conclusion. But the spirit of election observation is very much one of partnership and sort of cooperation with regards to looking to the future. So we've tried with these recommendations to offer them as a way of moving the country forward and trying to stop some of those sort of recurring problems that may occur in the electoral process. But in order for that to be able to happen, it's fundamentally important for both the government and the opposition to pursue the democratic aspirations of the citizenry and to deliver the necessary reforms. Many of these require legislative change. Some of them are technical, some of them will be behavioural, but many of them are legislative. And so therefore the Parliament will need to be involved in this. And earlier we had a meeting with the Speaker of the Parliament and discussed some of this. And we're very much interested in encouraging political party dialogue and cooperation in the Parliament in order to move this reform process forward in the appropriate way. My experience around the world has shown me that with the right political will, you can achieve many things. With the lack of political will, it's very hard to achieve anything. So there does need to be the requisite political will on all sides of the equation. In conclusion, I would say, just reiterate really, that this return visit, which is the end of the role of the EU Election Observation Mission, when we leave on Wednesday, that will be the end of the EU mission. And in many regards then, the EU's engagement on the electoral process will pass back to the EU delegation. And my colleague Patrick here represents the EU delegation and is the current chargé d'affaires there. We would encourage a full discussion on these necessary reforms and encourage government, parliament, the electoral authorities, civil society and stakeholders to try to find ways forward. You know, we're not naive. We understand that the political environment is still very fractious and polarized, But in the interest of moving the electoral process forward, somehow these issues will need to be addressed. So the shortcomings of the 2018 elections can be dealt with, and the positive actions can be further built on. So I would like to thank you for your attention. That's the end of my sort of brief presentation of our findings and such things. I'm very happy to sort of take any questions, and my colleagues also. And then at the end of the press conference, I think as Ed maybe said, the final report will be available for everyone as well. So thank you very much.
So please introduce yourself by name and the media outlet you're working for, and so where do we... Okay, well, before we start the questions, Patrick Lambrecht wants to make also a statement.
It's not really a statement, just to complement what Mark Stevens just said. It's an independent mission that took place, so we from the EU, as he just mentioned, will take over all the recommendations, with the 23 recommendations, if I'm not wrong. Of course, the implementations of those recommendations will very much depend on the decision or responsibility of the government of Zimbabwe, and that we have the obligation to do the follow-up. The follow-up can be done from the political dialogue, but also can be done on the development cooperation and projects we are already funding. Maybe you know, and that's maybe answers also of questions that you will have later on, that we have a massive support in this country on all kinds of different subjects, on civil societies, on parliament, on justice, on media, and alignment of laws to the constitution, etc. So a concrete response already to Mark was on the ZEC. We very much, for example, supporting or ready to support this post-election review that ZEC will launch very, very soon. We can also, improve the IT capacity, the communication, improvement of the voter rules. So we are here to continue the work that the observation mission has started to now. But again, it's very much linked also to the willingness of the government to do it.
Okay, so now do we have questions? Any questions? We have here one in the first row. Can we have a microphone?
Privilege Moshamile Joseph. Based on the recommendations that you have given, how would you assess the outcome of this election? What would be your assessment?
Thanks very much. Thanks very much for that. I think what we tried to do in the final report, and you'll see it when you get it, so I apologise that you haven't had it in advance, is to, in our executive summary, is to come to a sort of final conclusion. And what we tried to do is focus on some of the positives that happened, and we talked about these in our preliminary statement. I would include in that some of the sort of political environment during the election campaign was quite positively reported on. The voter registration was seen as sort of steps in the right direction. And there was election day itself was very peaceful, and people voted in quite large numbers, and that seemed legitimately large numbers as well. We then reflected on the other side, on the more sort of the critique. We noted that although the legal framework provides the basic conditions for the elections, there are a number of shortcomings in that, which we talked about. We then talked about the sort of role of the media and the bias in the state media. We then sort of raised various questions about in the voter registration itself and some of the gaps in particularly urban areas. And then we also particularly reflected on, among other things, the results process and how this wasn't really presented in a verifiable way and such things. And I talked about the electoral